Deputy Murphy, you're very welcome. I think you've just come from your party's thinking, have you? So I hope it went well. Welcome to the committee, and please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, sorry I couldn't be here earlier, but I read the opening statement and I was following as much as I could. Firstly, thanks a million for your work and the work of the Citizens' Assembly. I think it's really vital if we're to avoid the kind of cliff edge that you were talking about there, that we need drastic change to avoid a sixth mass extinction event, which will have devastating impact on human civilization. Just want to start kind of with understanding how we got here, right? Because the science is clear. The science kind of has been clear for quite a while in terms of the ecological crises that we face. So we haven't got here because we didn't know enough. Sometimes people who are opposed to taking action on the biodiversity crisis or the climate crisis like to say that, well, we have to bring the people with us. The implication being that the people are kind of slow on these issues, are foot dragging, have to be persuaded, have to be brought along, etc., etc. But can I ask, from the experience of the Citizens' Assembly, like when the people, or a representative sample of the people, were presented with the evidence, what we learned is actually the people are in favour of doing what's necessary, like understandably, makes sense. The people are in favour of doing what's necessary to avoid, biodiversity crisis and get on top of it. That's quite clear, no?
Yeah, so thank you, Deputy Murphy. So I think with that, it was a very diverse group of people, and we had people coming from all walks of life, and those who didn't necessarily always believe that there was a crisis. Mm-hmm. And with that, it was a very much evidence-based work programme. But I was impressed, and I'm very impressed by this, and I was surprised by it, I have to say, if I'm honest, because the people in the room interrogated everything that they were told. It wasn't that any one speaker could come in and give us the statistics without being interrogated as to where they came from, why that particular aspect was discussed, and actually where did those numbers come from, and behind that what was the underlying issues. And so with that, I think this is what the assembly process requires, but also facilitates, is that the people in the room get to interrogate everything that they're told. They then get twice as much time to discuss it in their groups and to ask questions about it. And I think that that's really key. It's not that anyone accepted at face value what was happening, is that, well, no, we're going to have a multitude of presentations, a diversity of perspectives, and we're going to interrogate that.
And could I ask then, so the Assembly concluded, and I agree, that the state has failed in terms of protecting biodiversity. So why has the state failed? And I would put it to you that fundamentally the state has failed because there are interest groups, and they were alluded to by Mr. Moore in there, who in the short term, their interest is not to deal with these crises. In the long term, I mean, if all of humanity is wiped out, well then, even the rich are affected by the biodiversity crisis, but it's not in their lifetime. And so, for example, in this country, if you look at the nitrates derogation, you have a very definite small number of relatively rich people, a section of dairy farmers, big agri-food industry, whose interest is to not do what's necessary. And it is the influence of, for example, agri-food in this country, big dairy farmers, is that having a negative impact on the ability of the state to do what's necessary in terms of addressing the biodiversity crisis?
So what I can say to that is, and you'll see it in the first two recommendations, that members emphatically agreed that, yes, the state has not done enough to protect biodiversity loss and needs to do more. And that's a successive generations of governments that haven't taken this as a priority. There is likely a multitude of reasons. Likely people didn't understand enough. We've accepted at face value in Ireland that we have this beautiful countryside and we will always have it. There's also, a lack of understanding, and I was one of those people looking outside on my drive home to Mayo to go, well, it's beautiful, it's green, everything is fine. And so I think a lot of what's required is the information and discussion and dialogue, as we've been saying it. But I think what we did well in the Assembly, and maybe something that probably needs to be considered further in policy actions from going forward is a diversity of voices. So for example, in our agricultural section, we had scientists, we had representatives from state agencies, and then I personally went down to the ploughing championships and invited 8 different farming associations who would all have a different perspective, and they each came and they each had an equal amount of time, and they each really contributed to the work and the considerations of the members of the Citizens' Assembly. So the Organic Farmers Association, the Grain Growers Association, Tallaght, Bio, Macra and Afirma, the ICSA, the ICMSA, IFA and the Hill and Natura farmers, everybody was there and everybody got to say something. Patrick may want to talk a little bit further about this because Patrick is a small farmer from the west of Ireland, but I think that diversity and the differing perspectives is something that's key to deliberative democracy and potentially could inform policies going forward. But you mentioned the agri-food industry, and the members of the Assembly did want to highlight that they have a necessary role in contributing to biodiversity gain and conservation and restoration, because they are people who depend on our environment to be in a good state. And so that's there in recommendation 43, you'll see. But I think it's something that the Assembly and deliberative democracy process does well, is including those diversity of voices. And as I said in my opening statement, I think, this is a time for change now, that we can see people are starting to consider now the environment, the state of the environment, and what we need to do to move forward. And hopefully now this state and you as elected representatives of that can hopefully move this forward. Dennis?
Can I come in there as well? Yeah, so I think what you're alluding to, I guess, is short-term thinking is what's got us into this mess, shall we say, is that people are tending to think on the short-term horizon. I think that was a theme that came out quite strongly through a lot of the discussions and deliberations. One of the early addresses we had was on being a good ancestor, and the kind of the Native American principle of, when you're making a decision, you think about how it's going to affect the 7th generation hence, rather than just your immediate time frame. And I think that message was very important, and it resonated through a lot of the discussions. And one of the ones where it was particularly tangible to me in a kind of current context was the kind of agricultural incentive frameworks tend to be on quite a short term. And you're asking farmers to make quite substantial changes to their practice in farming and saying, well, you'll get rewarded for the next 5 years for making this investment in time and effort. And I think it became clear to me that some of those incentive schemes need to have a longer time horizon, guarantee of payments for a longer time period that transcends the term of a single government. So that requires a significant change in the philosophy, I think, going forward. And just also to come back to your point about the enthusiasm of the citizens, I think you're absolutely right. That was really very striking, and especially through a process where there is that discussion and information, people very quickly became very passionate about the whole thing and wanting to make a difference. And I think there is a big groundswell of that enthusiasm out there. So I would reiterate that kind of push towards providing support and encouragement to community groups. There's an awful lot of people very actively trying to do things, and they're running into difficulties rather than encouragement and facilitation. So I think that shouldn't be underestimated, I think, going forward, is supporting that. And the final point I'd just like to make was a reminder of the Children's and Young People's Citizens' Assembly that kind of took place in parallel with this one. I think they were very powerful advocates, in that age bracket, came and shared some of their perspectives with us. Their recommendations were much more radical than ours in many cases. So I think we've alluded to this already, but there is a real push for change.
Just related to that, because one of their recommendations was the idea of the rights of nature, and I think specifically it was said about nature being treated as our relative, which I think is a good way of thinking about it. I think the understanding that humanity is a part of nature, that there's a rift being opened up between humanity and nature that needs to be overcome, and I think the concept of rights of nature is potentially a very important concept. I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of the indigenous understanding of the relationship between humanity and nature and how that's reflected. So could you maybe, I think it's something our committee is going to need to do work on, because I think having the right wording in the Constitution that gives procedural but also substantive rights of nature, I think potentially could be very important. So if you could expand on that, and also the fact, I think for some people think, I'm sure, how could nature have rights? How would they be exercised? Who exercises them? But also how they're complementary to the idea of humans' right to a clean environment, to safe living space, to a future for our children, our grandchildren, and so on.
We spoke about this a little earlier, but just to reiterate, the conversation around the rights of nature was something that members brought to me from the beginning of the work, and it kind of emerged from presentations that were given around global biodiversity, the necessity of biodiversity, the links between human health and biodiversity, and that with that, members began to come to me as the chair to say, I think I'd like to hear more about this. So as we went through, we invited Professor Anya Ryle, who's an international expert from UCC, on this, and she gave a great presentation that I'd recommend people look back over. It's on the Citizens Assembly website. And the first point was to emphasise that it's a UN declared human right, the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And that was the first thing that members of the Assembly wanted to highlight and emphasise as potentially something we have taken for granted and something that potentially is worth considering for bringing into the Constitution. And then a second element of that was that nature in and of itself, should we have a right to degrade it, to damage it? And that became part of the conversation, and we learned of other places across the world where it's already been protected, like in New Zealand, Spain, and other parts of the world that have already brought it into their constitutions, and that conversations are happening across Europe for that as well. So it's something that members were very interested in. It came naturally emerged from the conversations of the Assembly, and again, it was part of the learning of the process that we always try and incorporate the thinking of members and where they're going with that. But I think it was quite surprising how many members voted to support it, and I think that that's something that's worth considering by the committee for sure.
Just a little chip in there. This is not an area that I'm familiar with, but one of the members of the expert advisory group was Mary Dobbs, and it's clear this is a subject that is exercising the committee, and I can appreciate that, because I think it's there's a lot to take on, and we ended up with quite a lot of discussion, people trying to get their heads around it. And Mary was very informative in helping people to understand how that might fit and land, and I would perhaps suggest she may be approached for some comment. But one of the kind of particular things that she was quick to emphasise, which I think the fear was there that suddenly nature would have more rights than people, and it would stop. Those rights would prevent people from doing what they want to do. And I think she was quick to point out that nature's rights wouldn't trump the rights that we have as people, but they would become part of the discussion. That was the gist of it, as I understood it.
And I guess related to it, recommendation 27 on page 16, that the members of this Assembly also recommended that in addition to recent developments in judicial structures in environment and planning, that the state would develop an environmental court at circuit and district court levels. And I guess that kind of responds to the same question. And one of the elements that we've spoken a lot about and came up as a huge theme across the work of the Assembly was the enforcement of laws, which is difficult to do in a court system where there's so much else and there are a lot of priorities. But this was to follow the idea that in a lot of other countries there is this developed environmental court wing, and yes, we are developing that now at a high court level, I believe, but the members of the Assembly also wanted to ensure we had that ability to do that at circuit and district court levels, because in one of the particular presentations that we had, it was from a heritage officer, and she asked the question, who do you call? When you see something being done, who do you call? And that was a great question. And then it was, well, then how do you go about then following that through? And this is something that the members considered more about and then wanted to make this specific recommendation on that.
Thanks very much.
And